Make sure to visit the D&D website regularly to explore these new learning opportunities.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the June edition of the Product Spotlight with D&D Ingredients. My name is Trent Westoff, a dairy technical consultant with Elanco Animal Health, and we are proud to be sponsoring this month's Product Spotlight on their brand of Rumensin. So this year in 2026, we're celebrating 50 years of Rumensin as a brand. And although it hasn't been fed to lactating cows for all of its history, since 2004, it's been approved in lactating cows. With that in mind, I'm sure that many of us listening to this today have some level of familiarity or experience feeding Rumensin to our lactating cows. And with that in mind, we're going to focus on two different areas today. So very briefly, we're going to touch on the mode of action of Rumensin. So reminding ourselves how the product works, where it works in the cow, and what the expected outcomes or the value of it. And then secondly, we're going to look at what is the value of feeding it today in 2026 with our modern dairy cow. So as I mentioned, it was approved to feed in lactating cows starting in 2004, and we know that many things have changed throughout 2004, and we'll touch on some of those throughout, but we'll focus on some more recent research looking at different concentrations of rumensin in lactating cow diets and the results of those studies. So as mentioned, we'll start with, first of all, just one slide on the mode of action. So Rumensin is the name brand for Monensin, which is a lipophilic ionophore. So in this graphic that we're looking at here, we're looking at a cell, specifically a gram-positive cell, and this orange R represents Rumensin or the Monensin molecule. So in gram-positive bacteria, and we can think about these in the rumen for lactating cows or in our young calves, we can also think of them as coccidial stat, as rumensin is labeled for coccidiostat. Rumensin is able to bind into the cellular wall and allow this shunting of sodium ions into the cell. And when sodium ions are transported into the cell in animals that have rumensin in their diet, water is going to follow that sodium and also enter into the cell. This cascading is going to start this sodium-potassium pump, which is going to transport these sodium molecules out of the cell and potassium into the cell, and it's going to burn energy in this process. So we have rumensin fed into a diet. It's going to interact with gram-positive bacteria in the rumen of a heifer or a lactating cow. Sodium's going to enter in, water's going to follow, and we're going to get a swelling of that gram-positive cell. Now, over time, we're going to get the depletion of energy because this pump is consistently activated. It's going to keep burning energy, and eventually it's going to run out or have a shortage of the ATP as its energy source. That pump is going to become less efficient, and we're going to get swelling due to influx of water into that cell, and eventually that cell is going to burst. So in a very short snippet, that is the mode of action of rumensin when we feed it to our lactating cows and to our heifers, as well as to our calves for coccidial control. Now, what does this look like from maybe a little bit higher level view? So we're looking at a before rumen where we have a pretty even population of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. So our gram-positive bacteria are going to be our acetate, our methane, our butyrate producers, whereas gram-negative bacteria are more highly associated with our propionate producers. So before we have rumensin introduced into this diet, we have a general balance of our population of these two bacteria. However, when we add rumensin into this ration, we're going to select against those gram-positive bacteria, and we're going to do that through the mode of action that we talked about on the left side of this slide. And the gram-negative bacteria are going to fill that void. So after or in our rumensin-fed cattle, we're going to have elevated concentrations of gram-negative bacteria, which is going to produce more propionate and allow that propionate to flow into the small intestine of that cow. We know that propionate is a very efficient volatile fatty acid during the digestion of feedstuffs. We're capturing not only the carbon molecules, if we take a glucose molecule and break that into two different propionate molecules, we're capturing all the carbons, but we're also capturing hydrogen, and propionate can be seen as a small hydrogen sink in the rumen. So we're also capturing some of the hydrogen that's produced during the digestion. And this is the mode of action by which we're getting more energy out of every bite of feed because we're digesting it more into propionate and getting it to flow through the small intestine of the cow. And it's very efficient in terms of its digestion. So in 2004, like I mentioned, the FDA approved trials were done to look at the response of feeding Rumensin to lactating cows. And when fed on label, which is between 11 and 22 grams per ton, we see an increase in milk production efficiency between 2 and 4%. 2% at the 11 gram per ton, up to 4% in a linear fashion at the 22 grams per ton. So we're increasing our milk production efficiency when we feed Rumensin to cows, lactating cows. And for most of us with experience feeding cows, that is why we're feeding it, for the increase in feed efficiency or milk production efficiency. Now, what has really changed in the industry since 2004? And I would argue that we've seen a lot of change. Not only do we have different cows, so we have cows that eat more, they produce more, their genetics are different, we have higher components in our cows. We have different facilities for the most part. We've updated a lot of facilities. We continue to build new barns, think about how we managing cows are different. We also formulate our diets a little bit different. We've learned a lot since 2004 and how we balance diets, and we're trying to continue to evolve as we go forward. So one of our goals over time has been to think about this molecule that I mentioned has been commercialized for 50 years and fed in lactating cows since 2004, and continue to ask the question of where and how and what is the value of Rumensin in a lactating cow today in 2026. But first, we're going to start by talking about how much we feed given the mode of action. So here we have 2004. So in 2004, this example would suggest this cow is eating around 50 pounds of dry matter intake and producing around 65 pounds of milk. So if we were feeding 300 milligrams per head per day at 50 pounds, that's going to be 12 grams per ton. So I know that we each have our own way of thinking in terms of grams per ton at a concentration or milligrams per head per day. And we'll talk about a little bit why we think about in terms of grams per ton, and that's due to the interaction of the Rumensin molecules with the bacteria in the rumen of the cow. So the product is working in the rumen, and maintaining a concentration in the rumen is really important so we can get interaction with those gram-positive bacteria with the different molecules. So in 2004, with this 50-pound dry matter intake, that puts us on label at 12 grams per ton and is going to help us achieve that increase in milk production efficiency. And if we do the opposite math, our 12 grams per ton, divide that by 2 is going to give us 6 milligrams per pound, times that by 50 pounds of dry matter intake is going to get us right back where we're at our 300 milligrams per head per day. So one of the things that I mentioned has changed among many different variables since 2004 is our cows eat a lot more and they also produce a lot more milk. So over time, we're feeding this cow more. However, in this specific example, if we have not changed the amount of Rumensin that's going into that diet, we're still feeding 300 milligrams per head per day here. We divide that by 60 pounds of dry matter intake is going to result in 10 grams per ton of feed. So now we're not only not feeding on label, but we're actually lowering our expected milk production efficiency response because we've lowered the concentration in the rumen of Rumensin. So we're getting less interaction with gram-positive bacteria and Rumensin molecules, and therefore the expected response is a little bit different on the product. So if we wanted to maintain the same 12 gram per ton, if that's the concentration that we're comfortable and we're interested to feed at 60 pounds of dry matter intake, we would have to take that 12 gram per ton, divide that by 2, which is going to give us 6 milligrams of Rumensin per pound of dry matter, times that by our 60 pounds of dry matter intake, and it equals 360 milligrams per head. So this example helps us see that over time, we've had a cow that has increased 10 pounds of dry matter intake. However, if we did not increase our Rumensin concentration with that, our expected outcome from the product is actually decreasing over time due to a lower concentration in the rumen where that product works. So what does this look like in terms of a linear response? So our milk production efficiency improvement is on our y-axis, again labeled from 2 to 4% when fed between 11 and 22 grams per ton. The dark blue represents a 50-pound dry matter intake, and a lighter blue represents a 60-pound dry matter intake. So in order to feed at that approximately 12 grams per ton, you would need 300 milligrams in a 50-pound dry matter intake, but 360 milligrams in a 60-pound dry matter intake to maintain the same concentration in the feed. At 16 grams per ton, you need 400 milligrams per head for a 50-pound dry matter intake versus 480 for a 60-pound dry matter intake. And at 20 grams per ton, you need 500 milligrams for a 50-pound versus 600 for a 60-pound intake. So this slide is really highlighting that unless we've increased our Rumensin to maintain our concentration, over time we might be artificially reducing our expected result by feeding the product because we have not maintained our concentrations as dry matter intake has increased. So we were also interested in continuing to ask the value question. We know that we've seen in 2004, we saw an increase in milk production efficiency from 2 to 4%. However, all the variables that I've mentioned before have also changed. So we came back in 2019 and 2020, and we asked this question again. In a modern cow, fed a modern diet in 2019, 2020, what is the value of feeding Rumensin? So I'm going to set this study up for you, and we'll talk through some of the results, and then we'll come back at the latter half of the presentation and talk about where these data point to us. So we did one study in 2 locations. So we have a study that was done in Wisconsin at PhD R&D in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, which included 96 multiparous and primiparous lactating cows that started the study at 106 plus or minus 17 days in milk. On the on the New York study, the study was done at the Cornell University Ruminant Center, which included 192 both primiparous and multiparous Holstein cows. Started the study at 120 plus or minus 50 days in milk. And these were pen studies. So the cows were placed into pens for 5 weeks, as we can see here in the study timeline, for a covariate period, which was a diet formulated at 11 grams of Rumensin per ton. Then at the start of the study, pens were randomly assigned. So the pen was the experimental unit. Pens were randomly assigned to one of 4 diets, which contained either 0 grams per ton of Rumensin, so Rumensin was removed from this diet, at 11 grams per ton, at 14.5 grams per ton, or at 18 grams per ton. So again, we're kind of looking at cows without Rumensin compared to the low, kind of mid, and kind of the upper end of the label in terms of what is labeled to be fed to lactating cows. Studies were conducted in late 2019 and early 2020 for Wisconsin, and starting in mid to late 2020 in the New York study. So also a quick note here, body weight data was taken through 5 weeks at the New York study due to a scale malfunction. So we'll come to body weight later on in the presentation today, but just want to make us aware that a little bit shorter data on the body weight due to a scale malfunction in that study. So here's a look at our diets. So the diets were, I would say, representative in terms of the ingredients that were used for each of the geographies. So corn silage, grass silage, alfalfa silage, etc., that we would typically see in that Wisconsin and the New York market were used. The diets were similar in their crude protein concentration of 15.2 to 15.7. The ANDF was a little bit higher in the New York study at 32% compared to 27% in the Wisconsin study. Starch concentrations were 25.5% in the New York study versus 29.3% in the Wisconsin study. Fat was 4.3%. Our NFCs were 44.1 and 45.1 in the New York and the Wisconsin, respectively, probably indicating some elevated sugar here in this New York study. Rufals were 2 to 2.28 in the New York and Wisconsin, respectively, and these were both 54% forage diets. Some of the additives that were included in the diets were listed on the right, and specifically the New York study was formulated for the requirement of 1.19 grams of methionine per mcal of metabolizable energy and lysine at 2.7 times methionine. So if you're interested to look at these diets in more detail, feel free to reach out to me or one of your local Elanco representatives, and we're happy to share those diets with you. But for the sake of this presentation, we'll keep moving on. Okay, so jumping on to the results here, the first thing we'll look at is how are Rumensin concentrations, being that that is the treatment of interest. We'll take a peek at how they analyzed. So our control obviously came back with no Rumensin in each of those diets, but the remainder of the treatments analyzed a bit higher than what they were expected to be formulated at. So the blue bar for R11 was resulted at 12.1 and 13 grams per ton. The 14.5 treatment was analyzed at just around 16 grams per ton. And the 18 gram per ton treatment was analyzed right around 19 gram per ton. So we're really looking at, that 12 to 13, approximately 16, and approximately 19 grams per ton. And for those of us that think in milligrams per head per day, if we take a 60-pound dry matter intake, that would result between 360 to 390 milligrams per head per day for the R11 treatment, 470 to 490 milligrams per head per day for the R14.5 treatment, and around that 570 to 580 milligrams per head for the R18 treatment. Jumping into dry matter intake. So dry matter intake had a tendency for a linear reduction in the Wisconsin study, decreasing from around 60 to around 58 pounds per cow per day from the control to the R18. Whereas we observed a tendency for a quadratic effect in the New York study, such that the cows fed the R18 treatment ate the most feed. So we're getting a bit of conflicting results here, and the trends look quite similar on the control R11 and R14.5 between the two studies, but the green bars are kind of the ones that give us a bit difference. When we compare this to previous literature on Rumensin looking at dose titration studies, Wisconsin probably represents what we see most typically in the literature, and we're getting a little bit of difference here in how the cows responded between the two studies. But we'll start to encompass the dry matter intake, milk yield, etc., to look at efficiency later on in the presentation. So how did the cows perform? We'll start with milk yield. So milk yield was unaffected by treatment in both studies. In the Wisconsin study, cows were averaging around 98 pounds per cow per day, whereas in the Wisconsin study, it was around 98 pounds, whereas the New York study, cows averaged around 87 pounds of milk per cow per day. Milk fat is in the upper right, and milk protein concentration is in the lower left. So we'll start in the upper right here with milk fat percentage. So no statistical effect of either for the Wisconsin or the New York study. Numerically, the control cows produced milk fat at 3.98, and the cows fed Rumensin at R11, R14.5, and R18 produced milk fat at 4.13, 4.04, and 3.97 in the Wisconsin study. And in the New York study, we saw this weak linear tendency, so basically a numerical response from 4.6 in the control cows increased to 4.67, 4.71, and a 4.67% milk fat for those cows in the New York study. On to milk protein, again, no statistical effect. Numerically, cows in the Wisconsin study were producing around 3.15% of milk protein, And again, this numerical trend towards an increase in milk protein concentration from about 3.35 to 3.39% milk fat from the controlled R18 in the New York study. So we have some numerical changes and trends that we're seeing in milk yield, milk fat, and protein. So looking at our energy-corrected milk, we observed a quadratic effect in the Wisconsin study, such that the cows fed Rumensin at R11 or R14.5 produced 106 and 105 pounds of energy-corrected milk per cow per day, which is approximately a 2 to 3 pound increase in energy-corrected milk compared to the cows fed the control. In the New York study, we observed this numerical linear effect such that the cows fed, the control produced 101 pounds of energy corrected milk. Cows fed the R11 and R14 produced 103 and 104 pounds of energy corrected milk. And lastly, the cows fed the R18 produced 103 pounds of energy corrected milk. Looking at fat yields, we observed a quadratic effect in fat yield such that the cows fed that R11 and R14.5 produced more milk fat compared to the cows fed the control in Wisconsin. And that difference was 4.05 and 3.99 pounds per cow per day of milk fat compared to 3.88. The New York study, we saw a numerical response, no statistical effect, such that the cows peaked in their milk fat yield at 4.07 in the R14.5 treatment, which compares to the cows fed the control diet without Rumensin at 3.94 pounds. Very little effect in protein yield in terms of Wisconsin, and a weak linear trend in New York. Wisconsin milk protein yields were approximately 3.1 for the control R11 and R14.5, decreased to 3.03 at the R18 concentration. And in the New York study, cows produced 2.86 pounds per cow per day of milk protein in the control diet, an increase to around that 2.93 pounds per cow per day for all three Rumensin treatments at R11, R14.5, and R18. Taking a little bit of deeper dive, looking at milk fatty acids, we're looking at de novos, mixed, and preformed. So one of the things that we saw in this study that probably primarily differs to what we saw in our 2004 trials is that in 2004, we saw some study sites show reductions in milk fat percentage. Now, in the two studies that I'm showing you here, we saw neutral to positive effects in milk fat percentage, which is kind of a change that probably comes with a lot of different variables. So we've learned a lot more about milk fat depression and the dietary risk associated with milk fat depression. And when we look at our de novo fatty acids, which are a good indicator of fatty acids that are being made in the mammary gland, that can give us indication to how Rumensin is affecting milk fat that's produced in the mammary gland. So in our Wisconsin study, we actually saw positive effects of de novo fatty acids at the R11 and R14.5%, 14.5, such that the de novo concentration was greater than in the control. So this is giving us some indication that under a diet that is at a low risk for milk fat depression, providing that extra energy with Rumensin can actually have positive effects on both de novo fatty acid production as well as milk fat percentage at the cow level. We also saw increases in mixed fatty acids in our R14.5 at the Wisconsin study compared to our cows fed the control diet. And the replacement is happening here at the end with our preform decreasing so that the proportions can equal 100%. So we saw an increase in de novo, an increase in mixed, and a decrease in preformed fatty acids at that R14.5 level at the Wisconsin study, again giving us positive indication that the energy that we're gaining by feeding Rumensin and getting that to the cow can have positive effects on milk production efficiency, and that can be driven through milk fat as the studies are showing us. So feed efficiency. So increase in milk production efficiency is how the product is labeled and encompasses a lot of different variables. So here we're looking at energy corrected milk divided by dry matter intake. And we saw positive effects here for the Wisconsin study, such that all three treatments had a positive effect on the feed efficiency. And when we look at the trends between the two studies, the thing that we see is the greatest response in terms of energy corrected milk divided by dry matter intake is happening at this 14.5 treatment, which analyzed to be around 16 grams per ton. So we saw a linear effect in Wisconsin and a quadratic effect at New York. But when I look at these data, I kind of land at the middle orange bar here and see that this is where we saw the greatest effect in terms of feed efficiency is at that around 16 gram per ton or the R14.5 treatment. So body weight obviously needs to come into this conversation. So when we think about diets, and specifically on the dairy, we're thinking often about energy correct milk divided by dry matter intake. We're thinking about how much milk can we extract from a unit of dry matter intake. But we also have to recognize, especially in the economic situation that we're in today, where coal prices are high, calf prices are good, that body weight does have an economic value. And we're including this here, and we'll look at body weight change, and then we'll try to tie everything together with one term. But we have to recognize that if a cow is getting more energy per bite of feed when Rumensin is in that diet, that energy can go to a lot of different places after it's into the cow. So it could go to milk production, as we've seen in the previous slides. It can go to body weight. It can go to the development of a fetus. It can go to fuel the immune system. It can go a lot of different ways. That energy can be partitioned a lot of different ways in this cow. And we as nutritionists, we know this, but we don't often think about it. So body weight is one that we're going to just spend 2 slides here showing us that energy can go to a lot of different places in these cows. And specifically between the two studies, we see differences in the amount of body weight gain that happened over this study, with approximately 1 pound per cow per day in the Wisconsin study. And again, the caveat here is that this was only measured till 5 weeks in the New York study, but we're approximately half that for 3 of our 4 treatments. Overall, we did not see an effect of body weight gain, numerical response potentially in the Wisconsin study. And these cows fed the R18 in the New York study gained a lot more body weight compared to their counterparts. So if we remember back earlier, these cows also ate more compared to their counterparts. But specifically here in body weight, we're seeing an increase in body weight gain in the New York study for those cows fed the R18. So at this point in time, I've thrown dry matter intake and milk yield and milk components. I've thrown a lot of different variables at us. So we're going to summarize this in terms of estimated dietary energy. And this is not a term that we think about all that often. We typically think about energy corrected milk divided by dry matter intake as a feed efficiency value. But this apparent or estimated dietary energy encompasses the change of body weight over a time into it. So we know that partitioning of nutrients toward body weight gain is going to take some of those nutrients, and we should be accounting for those if we can in our research studies specifically to think about where is the energy going in these cows. And if we put them all together, we're able to take a more holistic look at the data compared to just looking at milk yield alone. So I think milk yield is obviously important to look at. This one might just encompass a few more variables. So we saw a linear effect at our Wisconsin study, specifically that the cows fed Rumensin had an elevated estimated dietary energy. And we saw a similar trend in the New York study. So when we look at these data, we can see that we're getting positive effects on feed efficiency, energy correct milk divided by dry matter intake, that it was highest in both studies at this R14.5. But when we incorporate how much body weight gain these cows also had, the cows in the green bar have an elevated estimated dietary energy in both of these studies. So what we're seeing here is When we look at the two studies, we see that up to around that 16 grams per ton is where we seem to be optimizing energy correct milk divided by dry matter intake. And feeding beyond that, we might be diverting some more nutrients towards body weight gain. So those cows are still capturing that energy that's being achieved by feeding rumensin. It's just being diverted to a different place in the cow's body. So we've talked a little bit about what has changed between 2004 and 2026. And I love this slide because it tells two different stories to us. So this is looking at solids correct to milk divided by dry matter intake. And I want you to focus on the left side of the screen. So the left side of the screen is showing our FDA 2004 whole lactation studies when we're going through the approval process to get Rumensin approved to feed to lactating cows. And we're just looking at two treatments here. So specifically the control versus that R14.5, which analyzed to be around 16 grams per ton. What we saw when we did that in 2004 was we increased feed efficiency by 2.3 percentage units, and our solids correct to milk divided by dry matter intake increased from 1.33 to 1.36. So we saw positive effects on milk production efficiency when feeding rumensin at that approximately 16 grams per ton. Now, fast forward to 2020, we ran these two more studies. But the first thing that we see is over that time period, we increased our solids correct to milk divided by dry matter intake by 20 percentage units. So this shows us that our genetics, our management, our nutrition philosophy has increased our feed efficiency. That is a great story in itself. We've increased over time our solids correct to milk divided by dry matter intake feed efficiency by 20 percentage units since 2004. That's a cool story to me. The second cool story related back to Rumensin here is that we saw a very consistent response between 2004 and our 2020 studies. The Wisconsin study, when fed at 16 grams per ton, we saw an increase in solids correct to milk divided by dry matter intake of 3.2 percentage units. And in our New York study, we saw an increase in solids correct to milk divided by dry matter intake of 2.5 percentage units. So the two storylines from this slide is that over the past 20 years, the industry has improved feed efficiency by approximately 20%. That's a great story. And hopefully over the next 20 years or so, we can continue to improve our feed efficiency to make our cows more efficient over time. And then with today's more efficient cows, Rumensin still improves the feed efficiency by 3%. Again, showing us that there's still value in having that in your diet and feeding it at a concentration that allows that cow to optimize the efficient response. So I've thrown a lot of data at us in our short time together here. So now let's take a step back and put it into practice. So maybe the take-home message today is to think about not only the value of continuing to have rumensin in your diet, but reevaluating the concentration that you're feeding at. And I'll show us two different numbers here. So I know that we talk a lot in grams per ton, and a lot of us still think in milligrams per head per day, and that's okay. We just have to recognize that when the product is working in the rumen, we have to think about at a concentration in the rumen, and we can convert that to milligrams per head per day. And this practical guide to feeding rumensin in lactating cows can help us get there. So given the increase in feed efficiency of energy correct to milk divided by dry matter intake in the previous studies was happening around 16 grams per ton, we're going to focus on finding the set it and forget it number. And for lactating cows, if we're formulating with Rumensin 90, can be 0.005 pounds of Rumensin 90 per cow per day. Feeding 0.005 pounds of Rumensin 90 will provide 453.5 milligrams per head. And when we scroll down this column, that provides 16 grams per ton at a 56-pound dry matter intake. Now it also provides on-label feeding from 41 to 70 pounds of dry matter intake. So when we think about lactating cows across the different pens or different herds, this 0.005 pounds of Rumensin 90 will have us feeding on label with a very wide dry matter intake and targeting that 16 grams per ton that we showed in this previous study at around that mid 50 dry matter intake package. Although we did not talk about dry cows much today, dry cows also can possibly have positive responses towards the start of lactation when fed Rumensin. So uh, the number to remember here is 0.003 pounds of Rumensin 90 for dry cows, which will provide us 272 milligrams of Monensin, and that will feed us in our desired range. And again, we didn't talk about it much today, but dry cows really seem to benefit from feeding around that 18 to 22 gram per ton. So at approximately 25 to 30 pound dry matter intake package, 0.003 pounds of Rumensin 90 per cow will achieve that. If you're interested in getting either a handout of this chart that I'm showing you, feel free to reach out to me after this presentation. Maybe we could even link it into the show notes here, or reach out to your local Elanco representative, and we're happy to share a laminated copy with you. Okay, so the conclusion here. So the question remains, you might be asking yourself, is what is a reasonable Rumensin dose for these mid-lactation cows in the modern dairy cow, modern dairy diet? So the data that I showed you today would suggest feeding between that 12 to 16 grams per ton is the optimal dose for that mid-lactation cow. And we saw positive effects numerically in terms of milk fat percentage of 0.06 and 0.11 percentage units of fat. In both studies, we saw a 2.4 pound per day increase in energy corrected milk, and we saw a 0.06 and a 0.005 pound per pound increase in feed efficiency. To formulate a set it and forget it number, we can use 0.005 pounds per head per day of Rumensin 90 for lactating cows, and dry cows of 0.003 pounds per head of Rumensin 90. So thanks for joining us today for this product spotlight with D&D Ingredients. And if you have any questions about Rumensin or other Elanco products, feel free to reach out to myself. You can find my email on our website, or reach out to your local Elanco sales representative, and we'd be happy to discuss the benefits of feeding Rumensin with you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to check our product page for featured products and promotions throughout the year.